Hey, good day. Today we're going to go ahead and cover frames per second and shutter speed. So don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. So to understand frames per second, you need to understand what video is. Video is nothing more than a bunch of stilled images called frames that are all put together and played back so that it looks like they're in motion. Okay, so I think the best way to go ahead and describe frames per second is, do you remember when you used to have somebody, they would write on the corner of a piece of paper, and then they would write on the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and then they'd flip them back, and it made it look like a little animation there? Same way that video works. It takes a series of pictures, a bunch of stills there. Remember, they call them frames, and then it starts playing them back to you. Same concept right there. That is frames per second. Now, it's how many it does in 1 second's time. Okay, so the big question, what does it mean when you're saying 24 frames per second? What it means is when you're watching your video, your camera is taking 24 frames in 1 second. Same as in 30, when you're doing 30 frames per second, it's doing 30 frames in 1 second. And when you get up to 60, it's doing 60 frames per second. So where the advantage is like in 60 frames per second, it's double 30. So it means it's taking double the amount of pictures in that one time, double amount of frames. That's why it's better to do the 60 frames at a higher rate of speed. If you're watching like a baseball game or a sporting event where things are moving fast, it's taking a lot more pictures during that time. Now, which is better, 24 frames, 30, or 60? 24 frames gives you like a cinematic look. Say when you're like in a movie theater, that's what is kind of giving that look and that feel. When you're doing 30 frames per second, that's more what like the human eye sees, and that's also what you're watching on TV. So it's kind of giving that look and that feel there. Again, when you bump it up to 60 frames per second, that is what's happening when you want to watch a sporting event or something that's moving really quick or something. You want to do it at 60 frames per second so it gets more pictures in that time, in that 1 second time frame. Now, another big question that's come to my attention that a lot of people have asked me is, why does the United States use 24 frames per second and a lot of the European countries use 25 frames per second? The United States uses what is called the NTSC standard, where a lot of European countries use the PAL standard. The PAL works on a 25 frames per second, where the United States, the NTSC, works on 24 to 30 frames per second. Now, the United States actually works for 24, which equals 23.976, 30 frames per second, which equals 29.97, and 60 frames per second, which equals 59.97. So the question is, why the difference? Why they show the 24 and show it differently? And it goes back to when the color TVs first were introduced, they had some technical issues. And the only way they could do to make it work was to downgrade the frames per second, to drop them down 0.1%, which brings it from the 24 down to the 23.976. That is the 1%. And they found that making it that little of adjustment is what went ahead and made it work, and they have still stayed with it today. Now, the 25 frames per second that a lot of the European countries use, I have heard is because the power grid, and I'm not 100% sure, but I heard that's why they went ahead and set theirs at the 25 frames per second. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about shutter speed. First, notice two words, shutter and speed. What the cameras use is they use what they call an electronic shutter. It opens and closes, allowing light onto each frame as it's passing by. Your speed is how long that light is going to go ahead and hit it, and it's going to stay open and let it pass. So as you notice, the lower your number is, say you're doing 1/50 of a second because you're doing 24 frames per second, it'll make your image brighter. So you're going, hey, that's great. I get a little bit brighter picture, that's good. But there's a drawback to it too. As your hand is, say, here, and it's keeping open longer, and your hand moves, it's going to be filming it during all that time and keeping it in the picture and gives it a blurry effect. So you get what's called motion blur. Now the opposite happens when you go ahead and you bump it up. Say you're doing 60 frames per second. Now remember, 60 frames per second, you're getting more frames in that second. But also the camera is going ahead and doing it, keeping less, it's not staying as open as long with that shutter. So as your hand moves through, you see it frame by frame, it doesn't give it as much blur. or almost none if you bump it up even higher. So you're going, okay, at least on the end, if I bump it up higher, can I go ahead and get even higher number so I can keep it as a little bit darker because I'm out on a bright and sunny day? I really don't see any reason why, if you're even doing 60 frames per second, to bump it up 1/200th of a second. It's really not going to make that much of a difference because you're not going to have that much blur in there anyways. But the opposite, when you're down low and you're getting a lot of blur and it's really bright, I would suggest an ND filter at that point there. That should go ahead and help you out a lot. So now, as a general rule, what a lot of filmmakers say out there is to always go ahead and double your shutter speed to whatever your frames per second is. So if you're doing 24 frames per second, you want to do 1/48th of a second or 1/50th. Remember, it's just dealing with the blur that's in there right now. So it's really, they're going to be close enough, you're not going to make much of a difference. But why do it? Why should I double it? Because what it gives you is the right amount of mix between the blur and the sharpness. So that's what the human eye sees it as. So when you go ahead and set it double at the rate right there, it looks normal to the human eye, and it gives you a good video right there. Okay, one last tip before we go today, I wanted to let you know, is never drop your shutter speed lower than your frames per second. What's going to happen is, if say you're filming at 24 frames per second and you drop below 1/25th of a second, it's going to be so bad a motion blur that even in post-editing you won't be able to go ahead and correct it or even fix it. So if you liked the video today, please give me a big thumbs up. And if you want to see more videos like this we have coming out, go ahead and hit that notification bell down there, or go ahead and subscribe to the channel. And I just want to say, I want to thank you today for watching the video, and have a great day.